Dylan FM Scotland, 16.8.
Welcome to A Look at the Bright Side. I'm your host, Nancy Zimmerman, and I'm here today again with Dave Nolan.
Hi,
Dave,
Nancy.
It's good to have you in the studio. You know, last night I decided a topic that we could discuss, and I think you'll be happy with this one. I was sitting out on my deck last night, and I have this Pandora radio station that has music from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. So I thought, why don't we talk about music from the 60s? Because Dave has had a career over a quarter of a century dealing with music and radio and what part radio plays in the music we listen to, because radio disc jockeys and station managers would tell you what some of the things we want to promote this artist, we want to promote this song. And so in the early days, and even still to a certain extent, a lot of the success of bands and individuals are tied to the media, are tied to radio, the audio media we have available. So anyway, I decided that I would research a little bit this morning before we got together, and was looking at the music of the 60s. Whenever you think about music of the 60s, you look at what came into that decade, and we have people like Bobby Darin, people like Frankie Avalon, groups like the Letterman. We also have the people who were still singing the standards like Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Perry Como, Tony Bennett, who is still
touring.
He's in his 80s, and his voice still has that same appeal. It's maybe not quite as strong, but it is still as appealing. And he plays on the songs that made him famous. I mean,
Yes.
People still want to hear "I Left My Heart in San Francisco" whenever they hear Tony Bennett.
Well, you mentioned a couple of my all-time favorite artists that I will listen to a lot still, and I'm a rock and roll person. I don't lie about that. But Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, in the house I grew up in, my father loved music, so it's going to be a fun show because music from the 60s, being that I'm a rocker, I was exposed to people like Jimmy Dean, who, if you're in the United States, people know Jimmy Dean for his pork sausage.
Yeah.
I'm not lying, but Jimmy Dean had a song in the 60s called Big Bad John, which, if you hear it now, you're like, oh, that's the sausage guy.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot to talk about, because not only did we go into a rather tumultuous decade in the history of our country and all over the world. It was a very turbulent time.
It was
worldwide, and that some of that in later years is definitely reflected in the tone of the music, and we'll get into some of that. But we had all sorts of genres of music that came into their element, I think, in the 60s. And while we were still very complacent and enjoying the music from the 50s, all of a sudden, in 1964, I believe 64, you can help me with this, Dave, we have a group that just kind of explodes.
Well, you're talking about the Beatles.
Yeah.
I had a life-changing moment on a Sunday evening, which happened to be February 9th of 1964 on the Ed Sullivan Show. Ed Sullivan introduced the Beatles to the United States. Now, how that came about, Ed Sullivan had actually traveled to England to hear another group, Jerry and the Pacemakers, who later had a song in the United States called Ferry Cross the Mersey. In England, or Britain at the time, the two big groups were Jerry and the Pacemakers and Rory, Storm, and the Hurricane. The Beatles would actually play concerts, or what later became concerts, with these bands, but they were not near the opening group. They were gaining some popularity. I mean, they weren't anonymous over there, but they were here. And Ed Sullivan went there, heard one of their records, literally walked into a record store, purchased one, came back to the United States, played it for his people, and said, "What do you think?" And his people said, well, let's try them. And, well, the rest is history as far as the Beatles go. A very quick anecdote. I said it was a life-changing moment. I was young. After that show for 3 days, I ran around our house with a wash rag on my head so I would have long hair. I had the Mickey Mantle crew cut. Well, everybody did because, Mickey Mantle, even though he didn't sing, he was the man. Well, that kind of changed not only music but people's appearance as well by the Beatles. It changed
people's appearance, the style, the clothing style that they brought with them. Some of the fashion trends began to cross the pond from England and over into the United States. I mean, there was just a lot going on.
Well, again, not to talk about the Beatles, although they were very predominant in what we're going to talk about here in a minute, including the British invasion and what artists came over. But when the Beatles started out, they stayed in Hamburg, Germany for a couple of years, wore leather jackets, biker boots, tight jeans, and had even longer hair than they did when their producer and manager, well, George Martin was their producer, but Brian Epstein, their manager, cleaned them up, suited them up, and fired their original drummer, hired Ringo Starr, and again, the rest is history as far as the Beatles go. They were so predominant in changing music throughout not only the 60s, but throughout later decades that in actually starting our discussion about music from the 60s, you almost want to start with them, but as you mentioned, they were influenced by people like Perry Como and even Frank Sinatra in terms of how they progressed their chords throughout their songs, how they wrote their songs. They were influenced to a certain extent by Buddy Holly, who by the 60s had, sadly passed away. Artists like the Big Bopper. That's what was smart about people across the pond, from our perspective of being here in the United States. They listened to what was going on in the United States, including blues music. A lot of rock and roll, was born out of the blues, which was certainly predominantly in the United States. In the 60s, especially the early 60s, nobody in the United States knew who blues artists were unless you lived in the Delta or if you lived in Chicago.
I was going to say, the blues was associated more, instead of blues rock, was associated more with the jazz movement.
Exactly.
And so you got that jazz sense, but I think most people associated blues and jazz as being the same thing whenever they're not. But when I was doing the research too, I looked at the number, and I didn't list all of them. I just listed some that I think were maybe, to me, the most significant. But there were all sorts of chapters in this book of 60s music, because you had folk music came into being. Then you went from rock and roll to rock. You had the blues rock. Then the big R&B and the soul music was very, very predominant with the Motown movement and taking things to Detroit. And then you also had the country music that made big changes in the 60s from what it had been earlier to a more, it encompassed more listeners. So, because I think before the 60s, you had people who listened to country and people then who would not ever listen to country. And if you look at how that change was started in the 60s, that transition began. Now, country music is extremely popular.
Well,
it's just,
across not only United States, but across the world. In the 60s, especially the early 60s, country radio was predominantly Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and they were small AM stations where you didn't get a big base of listeners, but people knew who Ernest Tubbs was if you lived, say, south of the Mason-Dixon line. They knew who Johnny Cash was earlier than anyone else knew who Johnny Cash was.
I was going to say, I would say the first two that I can think of off the top of my head that kind of broke through that barrier to more acceptance was Johnny Cash and Patsy Cline.
Well, Patsy Cline, to me, wasn't a country artist. She is, but she wasn't. She was so gifted. she changed the role, I think, of women on radio, let alone country women, because later in the 60s, you had people like Joni Mitchell, Joan Baez, of course, now my mind's blank. Well, Aretha Franklin, if we're talking about soul and R&B, she is the queen of soul. And I was so fortunate a few years ago to see her live. If you ever get a chance to see Aretha Franklin, no matter where you are in the world, you have to see her. She's just amazing to see live. What a voice.
Well, we'll kind of, if we take a chronological progression of this, we kind of got to the 1964, and you'd mentioned the British invasion. So we not only had the Beatles, but we had the Rolling Stones.
Which, you talk about a blues band, the Rolling Stones are predominantly a blues band that made it in rock and roll.
Yes, and I found them down in, whenever I was continuing the research, and I thought, Rolling Stones is down here in the blues section too.
Right.
So, I'm not a big Rolling Stones fan. So
they have songs I like, but I'm a Beatles guy, and to me, when I grew up, it was Beatles versus Stones. For some reason, you like one or you like the other, and since the Beatles hit first, most of the people I were around were Beatles people. The Rolling Stones were considered kind of street guys. The funny thing is, they weren't. They actually were fairly well-to-do people. The poor kids were the Beatles. Well, the Beatles had the perception, since they were in their shiny suits and all cleaned up, that they were kind of the wealthier, more well-to-do, more sophisticated band. Well, if you know the history of where these folks came from, the Stones actually had some money, where the Beatles were the poor kids. Yeah. I mean, the perception to me just still to this day kind of tickles me.
Well, and then you had the singles, Dusty Springfield and Tom Jones, and I think you mentioned
Petula Clark was one. She had a song called Downtown. Which, when you hear it today, it's still a neat song.
Yeah. There were a lot of groups, and maybe you can think of some more that came in with that British.
Well, there was the Who.
Okay.
Led Zeppelin started in the 60s, and how they got their name, just a quick little note here. John Lennon of the Beatles heard that a few guys were getting together from other groups, including Robert Plant and Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones, John Bonham, which was Led Zeppelin. And he said, well, that's going to go over like a lead balloon. So they took the name Led Zeppelin.
Okay. Well,
I don't know if people realize that's how they came up with their name, but it was John Lennon.
Cool. We can't totally get away from, before we get into some of this other genres, from the 50s, we can't get away from the surfing tunes of the Beach Boys.
Beach Boys, was Jan and Dean.
Yeah, you had those, and didn't they start out at the end of the 50s? Weren't they kind of? So they kind of ushered in the 60s before we got to the Beatles and the British influence on the music.
Well, Brian Wilson, who was the genius of the sound of the Beach Boys, his brothers, and some of their neighborhood friends formed what we now call garage bands, and started playing local gigs around Long Beach, Laguna, and places like that in Southern California. And the sound took off. They weren't the inventors of that sound, but they grabbed it and ran with it. And again, I hate to keep going back to the Beatles because there was more than one group, but the Beach Boys were so influenced by the Beatles. The Beach Boys' probably best written, most well-produced album of their era was Pet Sounds. It was influenced heavily by the Beatles' Rubber Soul album.
Okay. See, I don't
different
know.
Production techniques and, a different sound. And
I just know that when I'm out on the road traveling in the summer, I want a Beach Boys CD in my player. Yeah.
Be True to Your School.
Yeah. I mean, that is just summer music. Beach Boys are still just summer music.
Well, here in the United States where we live, we're fairly close to Lake Michigan, if you want to see something that looks fairly oceanic, but we still love the surfside music.
Yeah.
I still like, I keep mentioning Jan and Dean. They were about as good as the Beach Boys. There was a car accident where, one of them got injured and it kind of curtailed their career, but Jan and Dean influenced a lot of people, not only through the 60s, but in the 70s and 80s up through today.
So when did R&B, when did the Motown sound kind of begin to take off? I mean, whenever we think of something and we go, all of a sudden it's not there and then it is. Well, that's not true. It's been there for several years, but at some point, and I think it was with R&B and soul in the 60s, at some point in time, and I think maybe television has to do with whenever they took American Bandstand, and then there was Soul Train.
Oh, yeah.
That? You know, I think that created the audience, because it was for people who listened to American Bandstand. I think I remember that right shortly, like they aired next to each other.
Yes.
And so, you know, if you didn't get all your fill of music with American Bandstand, they turned right around and had a different kind of music with Soul Train, and it was the R&B and the soul, and it created the massive artists that we associate with R&B.
Well, you know, again, you had Ed Sullivan, who was not afraid to put anyone on TV. If you remember the 60s, how turbulent they were, especially here in the United States with race relations, he was the first person to put the Temptations on TV.
I didn't realize that.
The Temptations are the second most favorite group in my life. And again, I'm a rock and roller. Pink Floyd, Rush, people like that. But the Temptations were just captivating. What a talent.
I saw the Four Tops out here at the casino last year before last, couple years ago.
Right.
They still have one of the original
Yeah.
Four Tops.
The Temptations are sadly all gone now. However, there's a group still touring with the Temptations name. Over the years, attrition, and health, death obviously took away the Temptations.
But as members. as they morph
right.
one at a time, so that you still have the original intent.
Right.
You don't have the original.
And they're talented.
Yeah.
Smokey Robinson and the Miracles is another one. I've seen Smokey Robinson. You were talking about the casino. He's been to our town a couple of times. Motown sprung out of, believe it or not, Memphis. Now, Motown is from Detroit, but there was a sound in Memphis where they had a record label called Stax Records, which had people like Curtis Mayfield and some other predominant people that our listeners may have heard of. Berry Gordy started Motown in a house basement, which is still in Detroit. I've actually been fortunate to go to Motown. He was a genius in that not only could he find the talent right in his backyard, but when he produced a record, he would play the song back over small speakers, like transistor-type speakers. If it translated to those speakers, then he knew he had a sound. If you listen to Motown now, of course, everybody has fancy stereos, digital systems. You can hear the brass background, the bass, and what have you. You could, too, in the 60s because of Berry Gordy's forethought.
Yeah. We talk about the groups. There were also, and you mentioned Aretha. One person we don't want to forget in there is Gladys Knight and the Pips.
Gladys Knight. Well, I'm a big Pips fan.
Yeah. But anyway, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye. We had Stevie Wonder.
Mary Wells.
I
love Stevie Wonder.
I love Stevie Wonder too.
Now, I'm old enough, and I think you might be as well, seeing that I'm 15 years older than you. That's a little side joke there, anyway. I remember Stevie Wonder being Little Stevie Wonder.
Yes. Now, I don't remember, but I remember Little Stevie Wonder, yeah.
Right.
And it was before he became Stevie Wonder. But, Jackson.
Oh, well, from our home state.
I was going to say, we totally...
well, I was going to get to
Jackson
them.
5.
Jackson
I
5.
did not even have that down. How could we forget the Jackson? They were a monumental sound. They really were a fantastic sound. Michael Jackson was amazing when he was just a little tot.
Well, they all were.
And I never did become I was never a Michael Jackson fan, but he had some, the man had amazing talent.
Well, he's one of those artists and to get into some later years just briefly, like Prince. I respect Prince. I never was a big fan.
Yeah.
Michael Jackson's solo career, respected him. I do like Thriller around Halloween. But when
I like Walk Like an Egyptian. I always
well, that was the Bengals, but still.
Well, but he did a Walk Like an Egyptian
Yeah.
video, and he brought that. So he didn't do that, huh? Well, anyway, okay, and that's another decade. So we'll.
Do you remember your favorite song from the '60s?
Oh, Wooly Bully.
That's a good song, though.
Like that's Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs.
Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs. Now, there's a group to point out.
Of course, then there was always Purple People here too.
Okay, I have an anecdote about Purple People Eater. But let me talk about Sam the Sham here in just for a brief second. There was a group that was all image. They weren't that good, but a producer saw them. I believe it was a Southern California dive bar, and thought, these guys have something. Totally image. They were not that good of musicians, but they made a living. Let me tell you a funny story about Purple People Eater. That was done by Sheb Woolley. Years ago, I lived in a town called New Richmond, Indiana. If anyone has ever seen the movie Hoosiers, they used the town of New Richmond for the town of Hickory in the movie. It's a little town out in the middle between Lafayette, Indiana, and Crawfordsville, Indiana, out in the middle of just beautiful farm country. It's really just a big neighborhood that had a gas station, a couple of eateries, and a little general store. I'm walking from my house to the standard gas station to see my buddy Roger, who owned the gas station. It's a half a block down the street. An older guy's walking up the sidewalk, and I didn't recognize him. I mean, everybody in town had met. We knew each other. And I said, "Excuse me, but I know you." And he kind of smiles. And he says, "Well, how do you know me?" And I knew who I was talking to. It was Sheb Woolley. And I said, "Sir, when I was young, I had a 45 of the One-Eyed Purple People Eater." He chuckled and said, "Oh, you're the one." But it was actually a very predominant song, and it was such a pleasure. I mean, I've met everyone from George Harrison to George Carlin to, on and on and on. Sheb Woolley was like a highlight of my life because I literally had the 45 of One-Eyed Purple People Eater.
Kids still like that song. My grandkids hear that song. I mean, it's played every once in a while, and on the Pandora station they play,
Right.
there's a lot of stuff, and so they like to bop around to that song too. But
Well, in the 60s as well, since we're talking briefly about novelty songs, the Chipmunks.
oh,
David
yeah.
Seville. I had Chipmunks records, in the 60s.
They still, the Chipmunks Christmas song is still
It is.
played every year. That was it. You think about the technology and how he created that.
Right.
I mean, it was really a novel way that brought him millions, I'm sure.
I always wanted to meet David Seville. I never got to, unfortunately. But yeah, the Chipmunks.
And I bet Alvin still wants his hula hoop.
Well, somebody's got to pitch in and get Alvin a hula hoop. It's been years.
Whenever we're talking about some other groups and some other influences, we've got to look at people like Jimi Hendrix, the Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, who else would be in that? Joan
The
Baez,
Doors.
you said, The Doors, Steppenwolf, Creedence Clearwater Revival. I mean, we've got all those groups that originally, as they started, they seemed kind of like a more hard, jarring kind of rock and roll. And at the time, we kind of thought, oh my gosh, this is hard rock.
What is the world coming to?
I was going to say, right. But then as music progressed into the 70s, we found out that these were kind of bridge groups
Right.
between what we had become accustomed to being our new rock and roll in the 60s, or rock, and what ended up with in the 70s with, I guess they called it heavy metal. Because Steppenwolf was kind of, they were a
hard
intense
rock band back then. What is neat, though, about music from the 60s and some of the artists that you're talking about, I'm going to focus on the Doors for a second. You hear a Doors song right now, a song called Riders on the Storm. If you've never heard that song, look it up. Riders on the Storm by the Doors, and you would not believe that's almost a 50-year-old song.
Yeah. It's become a new classic.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Right now, we are at the studio talking about music from the 60s, having a great time, and so glad you could join us. We're going to have to take a break for a minute, but when you get back, we'll be here. Thanks. Welcome back to Look at the Bright Side. You're here with Nancy Zimmerman and Dave Nolan talking about music from the 60s. If you want to listen to this wonderful selection of discussions about artists and groups, you can go to www.nzbestself.com, where these shows are archived, and we hope that you will listen, take a look at that and peruse the website. If you have any questions you want to ask of either Dave or of me, feel free to contact me through the website, www.nzbestself.com.
I would love some feedback. Because music is my thing. And, I'm just tip of the iceberg here today. But if someone wants to get into some more in-depth discussions with myself or you,
I would love to have any kind of feedback from our radio shows, because as we progress through these shows, I would like to know what you've enjoyed, what you haven't enjoyed. I'd like to know some suggestions. What would you like to hear on future shows? Because I think if I can't talk about it, Dave certainly can. What topics I don't know about, he knows about. So we have, between the two of us, even though we are relatively young, both of us are relatively young, we do have an immense store of knowledge between the two of us. It may be trivial, somewhat may be trivial, but we can talk about anything and research anything, and we want to have shows that you, the listener, want to listen to, and we want topics that are not just local to the United States or to the Western Hemisphere or to North America, but we want to hear some of the things from those of you in the UK or Spain or Italy or Greece or the Sudan, wherever you're listening, and Antarctica. Anybody in our Antarctica, please feel free to let us know who you are and where you're listening from. Australia, New Zealand.
I would love to hear from people. For instance, you're talking about Australia. When the Beatles, and I hate to keep mentioning the Beatles, but when the Beatles toured Australia back in the 60s, Ringo was sick. They had a drummer named Kenneth, I think his name was Kenneth Wilson. So it wasn't really the Beatles. It was, but it wasn't, because Ringo wasn't with them then. I would like to hear from someone who saw them in concert without Ringo. I think that would be kind of a neat thing to discuss. We're talking about music, though. I kind of flip my mind back and forth to how radio was influenced by the music. Protest music started springing up. You had Bob Dylan, you had Joan Baez. You mentioned Creedence Clearwater Revival a while earlier. They had a song called Fortunate Son. That was a Vietnam War protest song. You hear it now, and I don't know that younger people, although they like the song, they don't really know what it's about and what was going on for them to write that song, because they had songs that were fun to listen to. Looking Out My Back Door, every time I hear that song, I laugh my rear end off, because I've been on that front porch before, I've not necessarily seen elephants walking through the door, but, close enough at time. I went to college, you know what I mean? But I hear that song and I laugh, and then you hear Fortunate Son, and it's such a 180-degree difference in attitude in what they were singing about and why. Bob Dylan, he's now a poet laureate. He's got a Nobel Prize. But back in the 60s, he was kind of like one of those people, protesting the war. I remember, my dad had been a World War II soldier, and my dad did not like hearing that.
Yeah, and I think for those people who did not live through the decade, who do not remember the decade of the 60s, I think, it was an extremely defining time in the world. You had the assassination of three major leaders in this country, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. So the fact that was what we grew up with and what we saw, and there was the war in Vietnam, there was the civil rights, all of the civil rights struggles in the 60s in this country, and it affected the way the United States was perceived around the world, and it affected the generation that grew up. Whenever we saw that protests against the war in Vietnam, those were rampant, and people had very definite views on that war. And the people who came back, who had served this country and came back to a nation that was ashamed and embarrassed of them, and did not treat them as in the same way that they treated veterans from World War II. So,
well, listen to the song "What's Going On" by Marvin Gaye. That is a photographic album put to music about what was going on in the late 1960s in this country. Not only the war, but the race relations that were turbulent back then. I don't know that people realize how much of an influence toward the good that Motown and Stax Records were for the race relations in this country. I grew up in a all-white town, went to an all-white school, but I knew people of color through the Temptations, through Marvin Gaye, through Aretha Franklin, through the Four Tops. I could Smokey Robinson and Miracles. I could go on and on. So when I got out into the world and met people of color and different ethnicities, no wonder I'm not on the radio anymore. The coffee hasn't kicked in yet. Anyway, when I met people like that, I knew them. It wasn't a foreign thing to me.
Exactly, and it gave them opportunities that they had not been afforded before, places to perform that they had been excluded from before. And it was, there again, it was music. The appreciation of the music is what bridged that racial barrier, and they were given a chance to perform. And it's just hard for me to imagine in this day and age, and it was hard for me to imagine back when it was happening, why that seemed to be something that defined who people were and what they did. I've never understood that, and just never have. But that's a different topic for discussion too. You mentioned in the protest, 1960. Did you tell me 1968 Woodstock?
Yes.
We want to talk about Woodstock a little bit.
Well, yes.
I think we have to talk about Woodstock.
That's
nobody ever
1960s music in a huge, unexpectedly huge concert, a great documentary. If you're younger and you haven't experienced Woodstock, watch the documentary. Do you know who the first... Let me ask you a little trivia question. Nobody knows this, but it's the God's honest truth. Do you know who the first group was to take the stage at Woodstock?
Have no idea.
It was Sha Na Na.
Okay.
Which was a kind of a 1950s revivalist doo-wop group that had a guy that kind of had a little fame in the United States back, maybe in the mid-70s, named Bowser. And he had a deep voice. Sha Na Na was the first group to play at Woodstock.
There was some good music.
There was some great music
at Woodstock, and it was just kind of a free-for-all, love-in, pot-smoking.
We assume so now.
I wasn't there, that was, that was kind of, it was just like everything was okay. I don't know that they had to, I don't know that there were any fights or anything broke out. I think everybody was pretty mellow, chilling out, listening to the music, had their best girl, best guy next to them, and just swaying to the tunes.
Well, you told me a story that the album cover, there was a couple on there, and they're still together.
Yeah.
See, I think that is one of the neatest things I've ever heard.
Yeah, I saw that. As a matter of fact, I saw that on Facebook just yesterday. It showed the cover, and it showed him today.
Oh, I would love to see the today picture.
Believe me, that you look at them and you think, they do not look like two people that would have been on the cover of a Woodstock album. Right.
Well, I have a story about Woodstock, a real quick one. I got to meet Arlo Guthrie back in 2002, I believe it was. I got to introduce him at the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. Yes, I'm a big-time disc jockey, folks. I've been on stage at the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts. Well, I was a big Arlo Guthrie fan back in the day. He had performed at Woodstock. My cat was named Arlo, believe it or not. Anywho,
You were a fan.
I was a fan. So yeah, as I was introduced to him, I said, "Man, it is such a pleasure to meet you. I love a lot of your music." And he says, "Okay, you probably like Alice's Restaurant." I said, "I do, but I like Coming into Los Angeles," which is a song about a cocaine trafficker. It's not maybe one for the kids to listen to, but still, it's a great song. And he had a song called "City of New Orleans," which actually
I like that.
I love that song.
Like that
He's
one.
the son of folk artist Woody Guthrie, by the way. And I said, I loved you at Woodstock because he was on stage talking about how huge the crowd was. And he says, "I've been rapping with the Fuzz, man." And they tell me there's a million of you. He doesn't remember it. He does not remember being at Woodstock.
Oh, doesn't even remember
He
being
does
there.
not remember being at Woodstock because,
I would say
you know.
he might have been.
It was the 60s. But I said, you got to be kidding me. You don't remember it. "Dave, I don't remember it." I said, "Well, has anybody ever brought that to your attention?" He goes, "Yeah, about a million times." He goes, "The first time I saw it, I was actually watching the documentary." And he goes, "I left my expletive deleted off because I'm rapping with the Fuzz, man." He goes, "Holy crap, what was I on?" And this is what I thought. But I thought, wow, I finally get to meet a Woodstock guy. What it was like, he doesn't remember it. So I was kind of disappointed, but still got such a huge kick out of listening to, or getting to meet Arlo Guthrie.
Just kind of makes you wonder how many of the people that you would be talking to that were there, how many others don't really remember the experience either, both in the audience and on stage.
I bet it's kind of a 50-50 thing. But if you get a chance to see the documentary for Woodstock, you have to see it because that is so what became of the 60s and what is now our music. In terms of rock music or popular music or what have you, the influence there was just, to me, almost strange now. Like I mentioned earlier in the show, listen to a Doors song, listen to a 1960s Led Zeppelin song, certainly the Beatles, listen to early Beatles, and then toward the end, the White Album. You're going to hear in a 5-year period, I don't think music has ever changed as much as it did over those 5 years because you had Motown, you had Stax Records out of Memphis, you had the California sound that we talked about with the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean. You had the East Coasters with Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, which I have to mention them. They were one of my favorite groups in the 60s. Tommy James and the Shondells was another group. Interesting sidebar about them. They had a song called Crimson and Clover, which had the first ever vibrato technique ever recorded and played back. Now you hear all kind of stuff that's all digital, and I'm not opposed to that, but Tommy James and the Shondells actually had some influence on later music just because of their production techniques.
That's you never know, and I'm sure those artists didn't either. They did something and they found a new little twist that they could put so that would be a selling point for them, that we're different, not realizing that it would be something that would be picked up and used 40, 50 years later as a way to produce a song.
No, they did it for the love of writing a song, and people
just
back
the
then didn't do it.
just the creation.
Exactly, just the creation. Now, there was some competition on what could be put down on at that time vinyl. There was a group, Pink Floyd, that started in the late 60s that, if you listen to early 1960s Pink Floyd, it's not maybe what you would expect because it was a lot of production techniques, and that's kind of all it was. But they harnessed that sound, fine-tuned it, and then put out in the 70s, which I don't want to get ahead of decade, but they put out Dark Side of the Moon, which is still on the all-time best-selling charts every week on the Billboard Top 100.
Well, I'll tell you, before I let you turn loose with some of your stories from the 60s, why don't we do this, music from the 70s and music from the 80s?
Well, that would excite me. See, the 60s I grew up with.
I know what to do now to excite you, Dave. We're talking about music.
I was pretty pumped up. That's why I'm stuttering. The caffeine is kicking in. And I have so much trivial history bites that I could start spewing those kind of things, but especially when we get into the 70s, the 80s, when I was actually working in radio. I'm excited about that. But
Okay,
the
you got
60s,
about, I was going to say you got about 10 or 15 minutes. Why don't you share some of those stories with the audience? I'd like to hear some of them, and I'm sure they would too.
Well, again, I'm going to go back to the Beatles first because that's my main influence in focusing on the 60s. But the outreach of the Beatles was so predominant in that we talked about the Beach Boys earlier, where the Beach Boys tried to out-Beatle the Beatles a couple of times on their album, the Beach Boys album, Pet Sounds. I can listen to Rubber Soul by the Beatles, which is an album that has my all-time favorite song on it called In My Life by the Beatles. You listen to that album, and then you listen to Pet Sounds, and you can tell where Brian Wilson was getting a little freaked out by the Beatles sound and wanted to do something special, which they did. Again, I was talking about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons were a mobster-influenced group that took their money and ran with it. They needed help getting equipment, production, and what have you. And if you see the play or what have you, the Jersey Boys, it is about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and it's just a great story. They had a song called Big Girls Don't Cry that to this day...
It's still a good song.
There were some other artists, too. I got to meet the late Del Shannon, who had a song called Runaway. And he had another song called Hats Off to Susie, which you hear
Both
those...
good songs.
Both great songs.
Yeah.
I love that. That was kind of, again, a California-influenced sound where they used the falsetto voice like Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons from the East Coast did. I think the most influential person I ever met, though, from the 60s was George Harrison of the Beatles. He was in a group in the 90s called the Traveling Wilburys, and I worked for a radio station that had brought them to town. I was going to MC the show. And I walked up to George Harrison, one of my life's icons, and I said, "Excuse me, George, I'm not going to bother you much. My name's Dave Nolan."
Not much.
Not much, but a little. I did try to, subliminally warn him a little bit. I said, "I'm not going to bother you. I want to introduce myself to you. I'm with the radio station. I'm going to actually MC the show. My name's Dave Nolan." And he looks at me and goes, "Oh, I've been listening to you. You're funny." Well, I thought he'd just go, "Nice to meet you," but he didn't. He had actually been listening to me, which stunned me, thrilled me, and, kind of humbled me all at once. And I said, "Well, George, I think I've heard you on the radio a couple of times." He just looks deadpan right at me. He goes, "Well, I suppose you have." And most our conversation. "Well, George, hey, nice to meet you. Break a leg tonight. Go
You
off.
get his autograph?
No, I never got a famous person's autograph when I interviewed them or what have you.
That was back before the day of the selfies, too, so you didn't get a selfie with them either.
No, but I do have some good pictures with people. Not necessarily music related. I have a picture with the voice of Fred Flintstone. Had to. Alan Reed. He was a hero of mine. And some other artists. Roy Orbison. You talk about somebody that came from the 50s to the 60s.
Yeah.
A beautiful voice, a wonderful personality.
Roy Orbison's songs, name some. I know, I can't.
Blue Bayou
Okay.
was one.
Because I was going to say the name I associate with songs I like, but yet I can't pull titles. I'm not good at matching titles with artists.
Right.
I'm good at matching. You mentioned a song title, and yeah, I know,
Right.
and
I'll tell you another artist from the 60s I got to meet that I can't believe you talk about somebody that tied country, popular music, helped evolve that, was Glenn Campbell.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, Dolly Parton did her share, too.
Well,
She went from a twangy, working with Porter Wagner when she was a late...
towels and boxes of breeze. That's what got her started.
When she was a teenager.
Right.
And she went, started writing her own music and getting away from Porter and that twang.
Right.
And, and that's not to say she doesn't still have some twangy stuff early. I call it twangy because
Right.
it's got that
Sure.
twang to it.
Well,
Because it's a southern, I have to
Still
watch.
guitar.
I have to watch, or I get a twang in my voice from Southern Indiana.
Right.
So that's just an identifier, not a judgment.
Let me tell you something about Glenn Campbell that people might not realize. He was a studio musician predominantly when he first started, before, like Galveston and, some song, Wichita Lineman came out in the 60s. He actually was a guitarist for the Beach Boys on quite a few of their songs.
I didn't
early on.
realize that, but I can see that he would. I can see that that'd be a fit.
Right. There was a group, well, everybody knows who the Monkees were.
Oh, yeah.
Hey,
we're the Monkees.
Yeah, here we come. Anyway, they were such an influence because not only did they have a rather campy, cartoonish TV show that I never missed at the age of 10 through 11 or 12, they had songwriters named Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart who knew what they were doing. You listen to a Monkees song now, if you didn't know who they were, you'd think, wow, those guys must have been popular. Do you know who opened for the Monkees on tour? Opened for the Monkees. Jimi Hendrix. That is the truth. Jimi Hendrix opened. Now, could you imagine taking your 10-year-old little fat kid like myself to see a Monkees concert and Jimi Hendrix comes out on stage? That would have been cool. I went to see The Who's 25th anniversary Quadrophenia tour. An old couple said, now old, I'm now old, so, but this was a few years ago. They were older.
So they're the age you are now, probably.
No, they were a little older, but as they sat by us, I looked at a buddy of mine, I thought, oh, no, old people, they're gonna dampen the occasion here. It's The Who, what are they doing here? Well, they had an opening act come out, and I have no idea who this feller was, although he was entertaining. The guy looks over at me and goes, so, have you ever seen these guys before? And I said, well, no, sir, I haven't. He goes, well, we've seen them. We actually got to see them in, I don't know, somewhere in Scotland back then. I said, really? Pardon me. He says, yeah, we've been all kind of concerts back in the day. He goes, we saw Jimi Hendrix. Do you know who he opened for? And I said, yeah, the Monkees. He goes, how'd you know that? My buddy leans over and says, you have no idea who you're sitting next to. But that's kind of a kicker out of the 60s that maybe a lot of folks don't realize. Jimi Hendrix opened for the Monkees.
That's that's amazing.
Well, if you hear early Monkees music, then you hear later, they tried to rock. You know, they tried to progress like the Beatles. It didn't quite work out so well for the Monkees, but I will tell you this, they did not back up to the pay window. I got to meet Davy Jones, their singer, at the casino one year. I emceed a concert where on the 4th of July, I introduced him, and he was only, of course now he's passed away. He was a very little feller. And I asked him at one point in time, I said, did they ever put you in like stilted shoes? He goes, nope, I was always going to be the little one.
I've got an interesting, Peter Nesbitt of the Monkees, who's the one that people kind of tend to forget. His mother invented liquid paper.
You're talking about Michael Nesmith. Yes.
What did I say?
You said Peter.
Okay,
Michael
the one we all forget.
Yeah.
Michael Nesmith, his mother invented liquid paper, whiteout. And, so was worth millions with that invention.
Michael Nesmith later went on to, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the 80s, but he produced a lot of music videos.
I didn't realize that.
He had kind of a look. The one that comes to my mind was a song by an artist named Juice Newton. It was called Love's Been a Little Bit Hard on Me.
Oh, that's a good song, too.
Yeah, and it looked like a Monkees out of the 60s video. Which, I'm not knocking that. That was fun. We were watching music videos in the 60s.
They just weren't calling them music videos.
They weren't. Well, we weren't that fancy back in the 60s. Remember Paul Revere and the Raiders?
Oh, yeah.
They had a TV show to where, they would sing 2 or 3 songs, but they'd bring on their guest artist of the week. And I remember the Strawberry Alarm Clock. They had a song called Incense and Peppermints being on Paul Revere and the Raiders on a Saturday afternoon. Sunday night, my dad's looking through the TV guide to see who's on Ed Sullivan, and he says, there's a group called, I said, well, Dad, they were just on Paul Revere and the Raiders yesterday. He said, well, Dave, all these long-haired guys all look the same.
They all
Strawberry Alarm Clock.
Before we've got about 5 minutes, but one thing we have almost dropped, and I don't want to drop this before we get the folk movement, which was kind of tied into the protest movement.
It was.
Because we have Simon and Garfunkel,
who I still love.
Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Love them.
Mamas and the Papas.
Mama Cass Elliott was one of the most gifted singers.
She was.
Vocalist.
Yeah. But anyway, so we don't want to, because Simon and Garfunkel, major contributions to music, I would say, and the Mamas and the Papas, Peter, Paul, and Mary were much more. They were definitely folk.
They were.
They were totally into just the folk genre. But these others, you know, we've covered some pretty good artists today, and we're getting close to time to wind down. So, any last comments, Dave, on music from the '60s
Well,
that you want to share with us?
So influential. I was so glad I was alive in the '60s. I have younger friends who will tell me, Nolan, I am jealous of you. And I go, wait a minute, why? And they said, you lived in the '60s. Yes, I did. You got to actually see the Doors when they were on Ed Sullivan, where Jim Morrison was told by Ed Sullivan not to say the word higher in the song Come On Baby Light My Fire. If you see the movie The Doors, it's a hilarious scene. I saw it happen live on TV. And it's funny the things that we grew up with, if you were in that area that we saw that, don't take it for granted, folks. It is groundwork for so much of what is happening now in music and what happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. I'm telling you right now on this radio show, music is about to change again. It's time for it. I've been doing this for a long time. There's another change coming. I'm not quite sure what it is. I have an idea, but I think it's going to be fun. So when we do this show in 40 years, we'll talk about music in the early 2000s.
Yeah, sounds like a plan to me. Well, listen, thank you, folks, for listening to Look at the Bright Side, and I hope that this look at music from the 60s has given you the urge to dig out some old albums, dig out some old music, go to YouTube, go to your local library
Watch the Woodstock
collection.
documentary.
Watch the Woodstock documentary. Get yourself educated about music in the 60s and see where it takes you, because future show we're going to do music on the 70s, music from the 70s, and then music from the 80s. We just, drop those decades in there and talk about music. Another thing we want to do too, we need to do a show on movies from the 60s. Do the movies and see how the movies, the music, and the influence on our society,
Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
around the world. So anyway, lots of ideas. Go to www.nzbestself.com. Give us your questions, comments, and we'll be happy to get back with you. So I guess this is a wrap, Dave, and it was good to have you here again today.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this.
We have a good time with this. I think I'm very pleased with the way that our interaction, our banter, is fun for me. So
I'll just quit trying to say big words I can't pronounce anymore. Other than that, we're good.
Okay. Well, listen, you all have a great day, and we'll see you next week on A Look at the Bright Side. Thanks.